The first flakes of snow began falling early in the morning, a soft whisper of winter brushing against the windows. I stood in the kitchen, stirring a pot of mulled cider, the rich aroma of cinnamon and cloves wafting through the air. It was Christmas Eve, and despite the cozy warmth of the house, I couldn't help but feel a slight edge of nervousness. James, my son, was coming home for the holidays. It had been years since we'd had him under our roof for Christmas. Life had swept him away, as it does with children, and though we stayed in touch through phone calls and occasional visits, nothing compared to having him here in the heart of our family traditions. And this year, for the first time, he was bringing a gift. Not something he had picked up from a shop, but something he had made himself. The thought of it warmed my heart. James had always been creative, ever since he was a boy, carving intricate shapes from scraps of wood he found in the garage. The idea that he had taken time from his busy life to create something filled me with equal parts excitement and curiosity. "Is the cider ready?" A gruff voice broke into my thoughts. My husband, Richard, poked his head into the kitchen, his cheeks still rosy from shoveling the driveway. "Almost," I replied with a smile. "How's it looking out there?" "Perfect," he said, wiping his hands on a towel. "We're all set for him." That simple word carried so much weight. Richard had stepped into James' life when he was already a teenager, a boy grappling with the loss of his father and the arrival of a man he wasn't quite ready to call family. Their relationship had grown slowly but deeply. They respected each other in a way that filled me with gratitude. By the time the clock struck noon, the house was bustling with preparations. The tree sparkled with golden lights, and the dining table was adorned with greenery and candles. Then a familiar sound, tires crunching on the freshly shoveled driveway. My heart leaped as I wiped my hands on my apron and hurried to the door. There he was, standing tall and confident, a man now but still my boy. James had his arms full, one carrying a small, neatly wrapped package, and the other holding a simple wooden box that looked handmade. His smile stretched wide when he saw me, and for a moment, I was transported back to all the times I'd seen that same grin when he'd come running home from school. "Mom!" he exclaimed, dropping his bags to pull me into a warm hug. "Merry Christmas, James." My voice wavered slightly with emotion. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart. Come in, come in." Richard appeared behind me, his face breaking into a rare, genuine smile. "Hey, kid," he said, pulling James into a firm handshake that turned into a quick, fatherly embrace. The day unfolded with the kind of joy that felt timeless. Laughter rang through the house as James regaled us with stories from his life, his work, and his travels. Richard chimed in with his own quips, and I sat back, watching them interact like old friends. And then came the moment I'd been waiting for, the unveiling of the gift. "This," James said, placing the wooden box on the coffee table, "is something I've been working on for months. It's for both of you." Richard and I exchanged curious glances as James slid the lid open. Inside, nestled in soft velvet, was a model of our house, intricately carved from wood. Every detail was there: the chimney, the porch swing, even the little garden gnome by the steps. It was breathtaking. "I wanted to give you something that reminded you of home," he said softly, his eyes meeting mine. "Because no matter where I go, this place, you too, are my anchor." Tears welled up in my eyes as I reached out to touch the delicate carving. "James, it's beautiful," I whispered. "Thank you." Even Richard, usually reserved, looked visibly moved. "You've outdone yourself, kid," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. That evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth and snow piled up outside, we sat together around the tree, our hearts fuller than they'd been in years. It wasn't just the gift or the decorations or even the season. It was the togetherness, the understanding that no matter how far life took us from one another, this home, this family, would always bring us back. And for the first time in a long while, Christmas felt whole. The morning dawned crisp and bright, the snow outside glittering under a pale sun. Christmas had passed in a blur of joy and nostalgia, but today the house felt different. Richard had packed an overnight bag and left early to visit his children from his first marriage. Though he had mentioned it briefly days ago, I hadn't given it much thought until now. The moment felt oddly suspended as James and I stood by the window, watching Richard's car disappear down the street. It wasn't the first time I'd been alone with my son, but something about the quiet that settled over the house felt new, almost charged. "Well," I said, breaking the silence with a smile, "looks like it's just us for the day." James turned to me, a playful glint in his eye. "Guess so," he said. "What do you want to do, Mom? Build a snowman? Take down Richard's precious Sports Channel decorations and redecorate the tree?" I laughed at his teasing tone. As tempting as that sounds, I was thinking of something less destructive. Maybe just a quiet day? "Sounds perfect," he said, his smile softening. As the day wore on, we found ourselves in a rhythm that felt so natural it made me wonder why we hadn't done this sooner. We prepared a late breakfast together, his hands deftly slicing vegetables for an omelette while I set the table. "So," I asked, glancing at him, "what's next for you? Any big plans for the new year?" He shrugged, pouring the eggs into the pan. "Not sure yet. Work's been keeping me busy, but I've been thinking about slowing down a little. Taking time to focus on what really matters." His words resonated with me, though I couldn't quite place why. I nodded, watching him with quiet admiration. There was something about seeing James as an adult, a thoughtful, compassionate man, that stirred a deep pride in me. Yet beneath it there was something else. Something unsettling. "Good," I said, forcing myself to sound breezy. "You've always worked too hard." After breakfast, we decided to take a walk through the snow-covered trails near the house. The air was cold and crisp, our boots crunching against the frozen ground as we strolled side by side. James had brought his camera, stopping every now and then to capture the beauty of the winter landscape. "You've still got an eye for this," I said, watching him adjust the focus. "Thanks," he replied, turning the lens toward me suddenly. "Mind if I take one of you?" "Me?" I laughed, brushing snowflakes from my hair. "Why?" "Because you look happy," he said simply. "And I want to remember this." Caught off guard, I hesitated before nodding. James framed the shot carefully, his gaze lingering on me through the viewfinder in a way that felt both familiar and unfamiliar at once. "Got it," he said after a moment, lowering the camera with a satisfied grin. As we continued walking, I found myself thinking about the way he had looked at me, not just today but over the past few days. It was warm and affectionate, yes, but there was something deeper in his gaze that I couldn't quite name. By the time we returned home, the sky had darkened, and snow had begun to fall again. We settled in the living room, the fire crackling in the hearth, and James rummaged through a box of old photo albums I had pulled from the attic. "Wow," he murmured, holding up a picture of us from years ago. It was from a summer vacation at the lake, a younger version of me laughing as James, then only 10 years old, splashed in the water beside me. "I remember this day. You pushed me off the dock. And you screamed so loud the whole lake probably heard you," I said, grinning. "I thought you'd never forgive me." He chuckled, his eyes softening as he looked at the photo. "You were always the fun parent," he said quietly. "The one who made me feel like everything was going to be okay." His words caught me off guard, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. "I just wanted you to be happy," I said softly. "You deserved that." James set the photo aside and turned to me, his expression serious. "I'm happy, Mom. And it's because of you." The room felt impossibly still, the only sound the faint crackle of the fire. His gaze met mine, and for a moment I saw something in his eyes that made my breath hitch, a depth of emotion that was both comforting and disconcerting. I cleared my throat, breaking the spell. "Well," I said with forced cheerfulness, "we've got plenty more photos to go through." James smiled, but I could see the flicker of something unspoken behind his eyes. We continued flipping through the albums, reminiscing about the past, but the atmosphere between us had shifted in a way I couldn't quite define. That night, after James had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the dying embers of the fire. My mind was a whirl of emotions, love, pride, confusion, all tangled together in a way that left me restless. I thought about the closeness we had shared today, the way his gaze had lingered on me, and the warmth of his words. I told myself it was nothing, just a mother and son reconnecting after too much time apart. But deep down I knew there was more to it than that. And as much as I wanted to deny it, a part of me didn't want the closeness to fade. Upstairs I heard the faint creak of floorboards as James moved about, and I wondered if he was lying awake, thinking about the same things I was. The snowstorm outside had intensified by morning, blanketing the world in silence and isolating us further in our cozy little house. I awoke to the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of James moving about in the kitchen. For a moment I lay there, savoring the warmth of my bed and the knowledge that my son was here, filling the house with life. When I finally ventured downstairs, James greeted me with a smile that was both warm and mischievous. He had set the table for breakfast, complete with a vase holding a single slightly wilted rose he must have scavenged from the garden. "Good morning, Mom," he said cheerfully, gesturing to the spread. "Thought you deserved a little pampering." I laughed, touched by the gesture. "James, this is lovely. But you didn't have to go to all this trouble." "It's not trouble," he said, pulling out a chair for me. "You deserve it." As we ate, the conversation flowed easily. James asked about my routines, my hobbies, and even the books I was reading. He listened intently, his gaze unwavering, and for the first time in a long while, I felt truly seen. It was a feeling I hadn't realized I missed. After breakfast, we moved to the living room, where James insisted I sit while he cleaned up. I watched him from my seat by the fire, marveling at the man he had become. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, but there was also a tenderness in the way he looked at me, the way he moved through the space as if he were trying to ease the weight of my world. "Mom," he said later as he joined me on the couch, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," I said, setting down my cup of tea. "Are you happy?" His voice was soft, but his eyes searched mine with an intensity that left no room for pretense. The question caught me off guard, and I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "What do you mean?" "I mean with Richard," he said, his tone cautious. "Are you happy with him? Does he make you happy?" The honesty in his question made my chest tighten. I glanced away, focusing on the fire as I gathered my thoughts. "Richard is a good man," I said finally. "He's dependable and he cares about me." James tilted his head slightly, his expression thoughtful. "That's not what I asked." His persistence both surprised and unsettled me. I took a deep breath, the weight of his gaze urging me to speak honestly. "I don't know," I admitted quietly. "I suppose I've been content. But content isn't the same as happy, is it?" James nodded slowly. His eyes filled with a mix of understanding and something I couldn't quite place. He reached out, taking my hand in his. "You deserve to be happy, Mom," he said gently. "Not just content. You deserve someone who makes you feel alive." His words struck a chord deep within me, and for a moment I couldn't speak. The silence stretched between us, heavy with emotion, until James broke it by pulling me into a hug. His embrace was warm and steady, his arms wrapping around me in a way that felt both comforting and protective. "I just want you to be okay," he murmured, his voice close to my ear. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice trembling slightly. "That means more than you know." As he pulled back, James placed a soft kiss on my cheek, a simple tender gesture that sent an unexpected warmth coursing through me. Our eyes met, and in that moment the world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of us in the quiet glow of the firelight. "James," I began, but the words caught in my throat. I wasn't sure what I wanted to say or why my heart was racing the way it was. "Yeah," he prompted, his gaze never leaving mine. I shook my head, forcing a smile. "Thank you for everything today. You've made me feel so cared for." He smiled, a soft, almost shy curve of his lips. "You deserve that too," he said simply. The rest of the day passed in a quiet, almost dreamlike state. We spent the afternoon reading by the fire, James occasionally glancing at me with a look that felt both familiar and unfamiliar all at once. As the snowstorm raged outside, the house seemed to cocoon us in its warmth, isolating us from the rest of the world. That evening, as we sat down to a simple dinner, I found myself thinking about his words again. About happiness, about being alive. It was a strange feeling, this mix of comfort and longing that his presence seemed to stir in me. "Mom," James said suddenly, pulling me from my thoughts. "Can I tell you something?" "Of course," I said, looking up at him. "I've been thinking a lot about family," he began, his voice measured. "About how much it means to me. And I realize now that you're the one who's always been my anchor. The one constant in my life." His honesty took my breath away, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. "James," I said softly, reaching across the table to take his hand. "That means so much to me." For a moment, we simply sat there, our hands clasped across the table as the storm outside howled against the windows. There was something in the air between us, something unspoken but undeniably present. And for the first time in years, I found myself wondering what happiness truly meant. Later that evening, the snowstorm outside softened into a gentle flurry, casting the world in a serene glow. Inside, the house was quiet, the hum of the heater blending with the occasional crackle of the fire. I had just settled into my favorite armchair with a book when James appeared in the doorway, a playful grin lighting up his face. "Mom," he said, his tone almost conspiratorial, "I've got a surprise for you." I raised an eyebrow, setting my book aside. "A surprise? Should I be worried?" "Not at all," he replied, his grin widening. "Just trust me." He disappeared into the hall, and I heard the faint sound of water running. A few minutes later he returned, motioning for me to follow. I complied, curiosity piqued, and he led me to the bathroom, where the soft glow of candlelight greeted me. Steam wafted gently from the large clawfoot tub, which he had filled with water and sprinkled with rose petals. "You did this?" I asked, incredulous. "Of course," he said, leaning casually against the doorframe. "You've had a long couple of days. You deserve to relax." I glanced from the tub to James, feeling a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the steam. "This is so thoughtful, James. Thank you." He shrugged, but there was a hint of pride in his expression. "Well, go on," he urged. "I'll leave you to it." I hesitated for a moment, touched by his gesture. "All right," I said finally. "But only if you promise not to burn down the house while I'm in here." He laughed. "Deal." Once the door closed behind him, I slipped into the warm water, letting out a sigh as the heat enveloped me. The soft scent of lavender filled the air, and the flickering candlelight cast soothing shadows on the walls. For the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself completely relax, my body sinking into the luxurious warmth. Time seemed to slow as I soaked, my thoughts drifting lazily. I thought about James, how kind he had been, how attentive. There was something deeply comforting about his presence, a grounding force that made me feel more at ease than I had in years. When I finally emerged from the bath, wrapped in a plush robe, James was waiting in the living room. He had dimmed the lights and added another log to the fire, the room glowing with a cozy warmth. "Feel better?" he asked, looking up from the couch. "Much," I said, settling into the armchair across from him. "Thank you, James. That was exactly what I needed." He nodded, pleased. "Good. Because I have one more idea, if you're up for it." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, should I be worried this time?" He chuckled. "No, definitely not. I was just thinking. I once took a massage course and I'm pretty good at it. If you want, I could give you a massage. It might help you relax even more." I blinked, surprised by the offer. "You took a massage course?" He nodded. "Few years ago. It was part of a wellness program I tried out. I've got the basics down, and I promise, you'll feel amazing afterward." I hesitated, caught off guard by his suggestion. But his earnest expression reassured me, and I found myself nodding. "All right," I said. "Why not?" James grinned and gestured for me to lie down on the couch. I shifted awkwardly, adjusting my robe to make sure I was decently covered, and he retrieved a small bottle of lavender-scented oil from the cabinet. "You're really prepared," I teased as he poured a small amount of oil into his hands. I aim to impress, he quipped, his tone light. He began at my shoulders, his hands warm and steady as they worked out the tension in my muscles. I let out a sigh, the stress melting away under his skilled touch. His movements were deliberate and confident, the pressure just right, and I was surprised by how quickly I began to relax. You weren't kidding, I murmured. You're really good at this. Told you, he replied, his voice soft. Just let me know if it's too much. As he continued, I found myself sinking deeper into a state of calm. His touch both soothing and strangely intimate. His hands moved to my neck, his thumbs pressing gently against the knots there, and I couldn't help but close my eyes, a soft hum of appreciation escaping my lips. This is incredible, I said quietly. Thank you, James. He didn't respond right away, but I could feel the care in every movement, the way his fingers traced the lines of tension in my body with a precision that felt almost intuitive. It was a level of attentiveness I hadn't experienced in years, and it stirred something deep within me, a mix of gratitude and vulnerability. When he finally finished, he placed a hand gently on my shoulder, his touch lingering for just a moment. All done, he said softly. I opened my eyes, meeting his gaze. I don't know what to say, I admitted. That was wonderful. James smiled, his eyes warm. I'm glad you liked it. You deserve to feel cared for, Mom. For a moment, neither of us moved, the space between us charged with an unspoken emotion that felt both comforting and unfamiliar. Then James reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face. You mean the world to me, he said quietly. His words settled over me like a blanket, filling me with a warmth that lingered long after he'd stepped away. That night as I lay in bed, I thought about everything, the bath, the massage, the look in his eyes. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to feel truly cherished.